Welcome to the 7th lecture of the webinar series organized by the Social Policy Analysis and Research Center, Faculty of Arts, University of Colombo. The webinar series, which began this year, is organized to commemorate the 15th anniversary of SPARC. So during its journey, SPARC has undertaken many research projects covering different subject matters such as youth development, globalization, climate change, disaster resilience, and other timely issues such as online violence against children and COVID-19. Let me now introduce our speaker for today's session. Dr. Nuwan Dias is a research fellow in disaster resilience at the Global Disaster Resilience Center, University of Huddersfield, UK. Dr. Nuwan earned his PhD in urban design from the University of Huddersfield, UK, his master's degree from the University of Salford, UK, and the undergraduate degree from the University of Moratuwa, Sri Lanka, and is a fellow member of a Higher Education Academy of the UK. His research interests include multi-hazard early warning, integration of climate change adaptation to disaster risk reduction, and resilience in urban planning and design. He has delivered over 10 invited speeches and keynote presentations for audiences in Europe, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, and has chaired over 20 sessions in international conferences and presented his research work in more than 30 international audiences. Further, Dr. Nuwan has published in 2 edited book chapters and 12 peer-reviewed journal articles. He is involved in developing research impact case studies for the UK Research Excellence Framework under the Unit of Assessment 13, Architecture, Built Environment and Planning for the University of Huddersfield. Dr. Nuwan has worked in many international research projects funded by the European Commission's Horizon 2020, Erasmus+, Lifelong Learning and the Global Challenges Research Fund in different capacities. In his different roles, he has worked with multi-stakeholders, including government, non-government organizations, and industry partners. Dr. Nuwan has closely worked with SPARC, and we are delighted to have him as one of our guest speakers. Before starting the session, I kindly request all participants to abide by the following set of guidelines to ensure minimum disturbances during the session. Kindly keep your mics muted until the end of the session. Any questions can be raised during the question and answer session after the lecture. Participants can either ask the question verbally or send them as a message. We look forward to your cooperation in this regard. While thanking Dr. Dias for his time and for sharing his knowledge with us, I would also like to thank everyone joining us today. I hope that this session will be fruitful and beneficial to all. Thank you. Floor is yours, Nuwan.
Thank you very much, Nishana. Thanks a lot. So, I don't need to introduce myself again. Nishana gave me introduction about myself. So, my name is Nuwan. So, I'm trying to share the screen first. Then I will go through with the presentation content, and we'll go through with the talk today. I hope you can see the screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, Nuwan, we can see it. Yes.
Right. Perfect. So, okay, let's make a beginning. The topic I'm going to talk today is about disaster resilience and construction, which has a very close relationship. But we are yet to think in many aspects how disaster resilience or disaster management is related with the construction industry. Of course, it is very well related and connected, but we are yet to think about it, and we are still to work more on this aspect. So with that, this is a very brief outline of the session today. The first thing is I'm trying to give you a brief identification, brief understanding about the understanding the key terms that I'm going to talk today in relevant to disaster risk reduction and disaster management. Then I will move on to the role of the construction industry in disaster resilience. So if I start with the key terms, the topic is disaster resilience in construction. So I think it's good to have some idea if you are coming from a different background or coming from, you may be working in disaster management area, but maybe you need some refresh your mind or get some idea. So what is a disaster? What is disaster management? What is disaster resilience? What is disaster resilience in construction? So I think these clear terms needs coming into to our mind in going through with this talk. So when we talk about what is a disaster, UNDRR defines this as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society at any scale due to hazardous events. So these disasters, it can be a man-made disaster, it can be a natural disaster. If you could see the left-hand picture, it is a man-made disaster, and if you could see the right-hand, it is a natural disaster. So a disaster can be a man-made or a natural disaster, but we are facing, even though we name COVID-19, it is a pandemic, but in a way it is still a disaster as well. So we can have that idea what disaster is about. And then what is disaster management? So if there are disasters, there should be a way that we manage it. So that is called disaster management. Disaster management, according to the UNISDR, is the organization, planning, and application of measures preparing for responding to and recovering from disasters. So it's mainly, it's talking about organizing, planning, and application of measures for preparing. That is important to know. It's not only recovery and relief, it's about preparing for disasters and responding for disasters and recovering. Some countries or some certain parts in the world, they still believe disaster management is only relief and recovery. It's not about preparing or mitigation. So that aspect is important as well. But how come this disaster management, and when we come to disaster management, we have this disaster management cycle. So it starts with prevention. Prevention means we are trying to minimize the impacts of disasters, impacts of future disasters. What could happen? Can there be a flood? Okay, if there is a flood, how can we change the built environment? Can we change the drainage system of our cities? Likewise, we can have the measures to prevent it or to minimize it. And then it comes to the preparedness. It comes with the people, awareness, letting know people that this sort of disaster is coming. Maybe it's about early warning. Maybe we are awareing people about the tsunami early warning system, letting them know these sirens are for a first wave. These are just only a drill. This preparedness is giving to the people. And then, of course, even though we try to prevent it, we are actually trying to minimize it. We cannot fully avoid disasters. So in that sense, when a crisis happens, a disaster happens, we need the response. So that is to save lives and minimize immediate impacts. When something happens, we try to minimize the immediate impact. And then, of course, it goes with the recovery with the post-disaster resettlements. And then what is disaster resilience? So disaster management and disaster resilience, they are like, I would say, two sides in a one coin in a way. So in disaster resilience, it's about the ability of a system, community, or a society exposed to hazard to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt to, transform, and recover. So there's a difference between disaster management and disaster resilience. In disaster management, it's about managing the process, preparing for the process. In disaster resilience, it's about trying to resist to that, absorb the impact, and according to that, how we are going to change. For an example, we know there is a climate change. How we are going to change to that, how we are going to adapt to that. So when it comes to that, when it comes to disaster resilience, we are always trying to go beyond the disaster management. So of course, in disaster resilience, disaster management is included, but disaster resilience goes beyond disaster management. So there's the disaster risk response and management spiral introduced by the University of Westminster. It gives some idea. So if you see the circle, it is mainly about the disaster management cycle. But with the reconstruction, there is another spiral going on. It is showing when it comes to disaster risk response and management, it goes with the prevention and sustainable development as well. So it tries to go beyond the typical disaster management aspect. So it's not hard and fast one definition that we can say this is how it is differ from disaster management to resilience or risk reduction, but these are the this is how it is changed as we can identify from the way it's functioning. So now we got the idea about the disasters, disaster management, and the disaster resilience. And then we have the question disaster resilience in construction. So it is important when it comes to construction, people have the idea construction means, oh, I think typically in our minds as humans, we get the idea, oh, construction means a building. But a construction, it's not only buildings, it's about roads, it's bridges, tunnels, railways, everything is related with the construction. So it's not about the resilience of buildings. So, and also on the other hand, disaster resilience in construction is not only about new houses. So some people may think, okay, we can't do anything for the existing stock of houses or existing stock of buildings. We may think, okay, it's the new builds, we have to make them resilient. No, it's about old housing stock as well, old building stock as well. So disaster resilience in construction, when it comes, it's not about only buildings, it's not about new things, it is about repairing, refurbishing, renovating, and restoring the ones that we already have as well. So with that, disaster resilience in construction. So disaster resilience is the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt to, transform, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner. The construction industry, of course, they can provide the ability that can be determined by the way we plan, design, and engineer the built environment or our construction industry. So this is how disaster resilience and construction industry is getting the interrelationship. So I'm trying to give you, this is actually additional slide. I just wanted to give you some idea. I think most of you are aware about the Sendai framework. When it comes to disaster management, disaster resilience, there is a global framework called Sendai framework, which is applicable for the whole globe actually. So it has identified the Sendai priority areas, its targets and all. I'm not going to talk about the Sendai framework. So I just wanted to mention that these things are governed by the Sendai framework globally. So the policies are already there. What we need to do is we need to implement them in the ground level. So it's just about to give you some idea about the current global frameworks. So with this, I would like to go to the next section on the role of the construction industry in disaster management. So to do that, for the easiness of explaining things, I'm using the disaster management cycle because it has specifically divided response, recovery, prevention, preparedness stages. So I'm using this to explain the role in the construction industry. With that, I will move on to the next section. Before that, I hope you are clear with what we have been discussed. So as Nishara mentioned, we will go for the questions and answering session at the end. So thinking that you are clear with what we have been discussing, I'm moving to the next session. So now, as I mentioned, there are stages called prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. And here I'm picking four key built environment professionals: architects, surveyors, planners, and engineers. Of course, these built environment professionals, they incorporate together and they work together. These are overlap duties. And apart from these four professionals, we definitely have many other professionals as well. I'm just trying to give you some introductory idea about how built environment professionals are involved and how they have to help to ensure our cities are disaster resilient. So with that, now I'm going with the disaster management cycle and as well as with the profession wise. So if I start with the prevention, when it comes to prevention, it has two aspects. Prevention has risk and vulnerability assessment in one hand, that is to identify what is the risk and what is the vulnerability of a particular area. And then we have the mitigation. So here, first I will talk about the risk and vulnerability assessment. So that is in the risk and vulnerability assessment, it identifies the nature and magnitude of current and future risk from hazard. So if we take a city, if we take a particular, let's say in Sri Lankan context, DS division, so we are trying to identify what is the current and future risk and what are the existing people, infrastructure and buildings. So make them record. That is risk and vulnerability assessment. So in that, what could architects do is they can pinpoint historically and culturally buildings at risk. They know what are the listed buildings in the area, what are the historically relevant. So for an example, let's say we are working with the with Anuradhapura and maybe some ancient area ruins are affected from the from a future disaster. So that can be pinpointed by architects. Of course, other professionals can also do that, but I'm trying to divide them according to the profession so you can get some clear idea. And the urban planners, what they could do is they can analyze the effectiveness of regulations and policies, because when we identify the risk and vulnerability, if the current policies, if they don't address the risk and vulnerability issues, urban planners can look into the new policies and regulations. And of course, they can assess the potential access issues during a disaster, because in a disaster, transportation planning becomes very important. So they can look into the potential access points at this stage. And the surveyors, they can assess the general stock of building and provide the cost of mitigation. So to do the to minimize the risk, what could be done and how much it costs. Those things surveyors can done. Building surveyors, quantity surveyors, and the engineers, they can assess the stability and vulnerability of structures, specifically civil engineers. And then when it comes to the prevention again, we can move on to disaster risk reduction and mitigation. There are many disaster risk reduction and mitigation measures. That is preparing a strategy to reduce vulnerability against known risk. What are the known risks? Because we did the in the previous, we did the risk and vulnerability, so we know what is the risk and vulnerability. So against that, how we could reduce it. So actually, this is a complex and continuous exercise involving strengthening vulnerable structures, preventing building activity in high-risk areas, more things, managing and maintaining assets and all. With that, architects could facilitate community surveys and advise on the planning and community shelters and dwellings, because we know the risk, and if it is a high-risk area, maybe we could have community shelters designed in early stages, where the architects could help with that. And then in terms of planners, they can identify the risk associated with the areas, advise on risk reduction. They can plan for quality development in the right locations. If there are new developments are going on, they can avoid the risk areas. They can inform that into the urban planning regulatory bodies and avoid those areas, and develop new regulations to cater the identified risk, and development of new stakeholder partnerships, of course. And the surveys, they can advise on the cost, same as in the previous one, mitigatory cost and all. And the engineers, they can specify structural requirements and retrofitting measures, again, similar with the vulnerability assessment. So in the prevention, these key professionals, they can involve in these ways. And when it comes to, again, we talked about the prevention aspect. So in the prevention aspect, there are two things. If I go back, risk and vulnerability assessment, that the key professionals can involve in these ways. And then we have the disaster risk reduction and mitigation. Once we know the vulnerability and the risk, the mitigation aspects could be taken, and these key professionals can take these aspects, these actions. And then with that, we can move to, after the prevention, that is to minimize impacts, we can go for preparedness, to prepare for the managing the crisis, how we prepare for managing the crisis. So while all practical measures should be taken to avoid hazards becoming a disaster, it is often impractical to eliminate all risk. So that is what I mentioned earlier as well. Even though we take all the actions to minimize an hazard become a disaster, we cannot completely avoid them. So in terms of that, we have to come for the preparedness measures. So for that, we need to plan for effective disaster preparedness. In doing disaster preparedness, architects, they could provide advice on building use in the event of hazards, because architects can help with that, how we should use particular buildings, because they know the internal arrangement, internal space arrangements. With that, they can help. Surveyors advise on the cost and delivery of disaster. It's mainly in surveys. When it comes to surveys, they are mainly with the cost management aspect. And the planners locate settlements and define those most at risk. That is mainly joining with the previous slide as well. Urban planners, I think even currently in the Sri Lankan context as well, organizations like NBRO, they identify the risk areas in the landslide prone areas, and they identify those areas as risk and inform people to avoid those areas for any further development. So those measures could be taken. That is the role of them. And transport planning for access during disaster is also very important. That is actually immediately after a disaster, the motorways, the road network could be damaged. So there should be some alternative measures that we should have identified in case of a disaster, that we provide basic facilities to the affected people. So transport planning is critically important, that urban planners could identify alternative routes in maybe evacuation routes. They could plan for identify evacuation routes as well in terms of in a case of a disaster. So, and the engineers specify measures for providing strength in the existing structure. So that is how they could contribute in terms of preparedness. Like, let's say there's a listed building and the structure is weak. So the civil engineers could provide before a disaster how we could strengthen the structures. That measures could be taken in terms of preparedness. And then we are coming to now, if we move back to this circle. So we have the prevention, and we try to minimize the impacts, and we are prepared. But then crisis happens. We couldn't avoid that. But we have taken actions to minimize the impact, and we have prepared ourselves. But still, the crisis happened. Now, what comes is the response. That is to save lives and minimize immediate response. So when it comes to response, so emergency relief is the first thing which comes. So that is the aftermath of a disaster can severely disrupt the provision of basic services and facilities. Along with medical aid, existing provision of clean drinking water and basic sanitation are therefore vital. So when there's a crisis, evacuation becomes the first priority, and immediately after that, the emergency relief, because people are affected. Maybe they left the houses without what they were wearing. So we need to provide the sanitary facilities and basic food needs and so on. So in that, the roles of different professionals are surveyors. They could identify the usability of existing infrastructure now, in collaboration with planners and engineers, estimate cost of installation and procurement and maintenance. So that may be in the immediate sense. If there are no alternative routes, or even if the alternative roads are damaged, maybe the surveys could identify how we could quickly repair the existing infrastructure in terms of provide the basic facilities and all? How could we clear what is the cost involved with that? That can be done in terms of the surveyors. And the planners, they can estimate the demand for clean water. And sometimes I want to make a point here. When it comes to urban planning, there's a view or there's a thinking, one school of thought thinking that urban planners just plan cities. But urban planner's role is not just planning physical structures. Urban planner is something trying to work on the multidisciplinary nature, addressing the physical, social, economic, and environmental issues. So urban planner is not just someone planning the buildings or a nice tall building with architects. They are responsible to ensure the social sustainability, resilience, and boom of economy, and even in a disaster, how we could make the cities function. So what they could do is they could estimate the demand for clean water and the locations it will be required, liaise with the community leaders and local authorities to plan the supply. They can help with that planning aspect. So and the engineers, they could plan and provide locally suitable technology to re-establish drinking water, because at the emergency relief, it is very important to have the source of water as well. So if the wells are damaged with mud and all, so it should be cleaned immediately. So those things could be done by the engineers. They could do the lab testing immediately. So in that aspect, they can help. And then it comes to role of construction industry gaining response. So this is generally interrelated or combinedly done with the different professionals. So logistic planning in emergency situation involves dispatching commodities, example, medical materials and personnel, specified rescue equipment and rescue teams, food, etc. So to distribution centers in affected areas as soon as possible. So in emergency relief, many professionals can involve, not only the construction industry, members of the NGOs or members of the community groups, all of them could do that. Obviously, of course, this is, I think, when it comes to the Sri Lankan context, what I understood is the emergency response relief happens in a quite a good way. What is lacking, maybe, it's just my personal view, maybe the preparedness and prevention measures. But so in terms of when it comes to response, it is well organized in Sri Lanka as per my personal view, so not for the records. And then this includes evaluate local access issues and plan for the transportation and storage shelter for suppliers, services and rescuers to the disaster areas, and establish the priority needs and requirements of affected communities. Are there any medical emergencies, sort of things? Solutions for delivery of material and people to affected areas, and secure storage of essential supply. Maybe if the common area, storage areas are damaged, maybe some temporary arrangements are needed. So this is again linking with the preparedness. So maybe if we have some public open spaces or public, not only the public places, like in the Sri Lankan context, generally when a disaster happens, temples, churches, mosques, these places become the public places for the immediate accommodation. Maybe there could be different sites designed for evacuation, like for public open spaces. Maybe parks can be converted into emergency relief centers. So those could be identified in the early stages by the urban planners. That will be very helpful in responding to the immediate emergency scenarios. And then again, of course, what is next important is the emergency relief shelters. When it comes to emergency relief shelters, provide emergency shelters to families who have lost their homes due to disasters. Disaster relief shelters play a vital role in large-scale disasters and are an important part. So the architects, of course, they can design relief shelters for dwellings as well as larger structures for essential services such as medical facilities and vulnerable groups that need special accommodations such as the sick and injured. So again, this is architects could do this in the preparedness stage as well. So that's why I mentioned this cycle is, we cannot divide it like okay, this is done from this point, this is done from that point. We cannot do that. It's linked. So the activities which could be needed in the response could be done in the preparedness stage as well. So the design relief shelters for the architects and surveyors, advice on procurement of shelters, work with local authorities and communities to make the best use of local skills and labors in that way. And the planners estimate the demand for relief shelter, including number, types and locations, consider medium long-term issues associated with the shelter location. Those aspects in a broader scale, they can work on it. And immediately, if shelters are some distance from employment locations, if they need to, till the structures are done, if they need to move for their livelihoods, how they could be the location, identifying the location for that is important as well. And the engineers, technical design of relief structures for bulk production use, ensure designs are safe in the aftermath of disasters, like for example, it may be in an earthquake situation, whether the structure is now the identified area, the structure, are they previously damaged, are they safe? So that aspects they can do before resettling temporarily people in those areas. And again, I'm moving to the disaster management cycle. So we spoke about prevention, preparedness, crisis happens, and the response. And then we are moving to the recovery. When it comes to recovery is about to restore activities and services. But of course, recovery also has two aspects. That is early recovery and the post-disaster resettlement. To tell you that now, this is actually, if we let's say like this, so the things I'm talking today, maybe we can have 5 talks or 6 talks in detail. So you may, what I'm trying to do is just to give you some overall idea about how is the process and how the different professionals can do their part in terms of creating resilience in our cities in relation to the construction. So even if you take the early recovery, or even if you take the post-disaster resettlement, it is a different topic. We could talk for a day. So you may have gray areas, of course, but I think if you are interested in a particular area or any more information, obviously you can contact me and we can discuss it. But just I wanted to give you that idea, because I'm trying to cover a lot within 1 hour, because this is not a particular session. This is about giving some overall idea. That's why. So early recovery aims to provide communities with safety nets, accurate information, and access to resources. So opportunities and capacities to rebuild their lives. So that is what done in the early recovery at a moment when they are most vulnerable. So this is not maybe they are immediately moved into shelters, and then the early recovery is important if the permanent reconstruction takes time. It's not only the physical structures, but as well as there are psychological needs as well, which I'm not going to talk today. Of course, people have gone through a trauma, so they need they may have lost their family members. So it's a different aspect that we need to talk with that we need to tackle with the health and medical professionals, how we could help them in the early recovery in terms of comforting them. So that's a different topic. But in terms of the construction, this includes provision of interim settlements and transitional dwellings, access to livelihoods, employment and education. Of course, we cannot let our lives stop at a disaster point. We have to move on. The best example is the COVID-19. So when COVID-19 happened, we had a thought everything is going to stop, but no, things are moving. Now we are in a way called hybrid events, online events, and most of the things are happening in an online. Of course, there are merits and demerits, disadvantages and advantages, but we have to move on. So with that, we have to, even though they are in temporary settlements, the access to livelihoods, employment and education needs are important. So that should be considered even in the early recovery stage. And carry out building condition surveys, including assessment of key buildings and overall damage assessment, identify safe sites for setting up facilities, review land use, transport and access lines, those things. So these are like a summary of things. So if I think we still got some time to discuss, so I just put them in separate slides in terms we didn't have time, we don't have time, but I think we could talk a little bit about the early recovery in detail. When it comes to early recovery, it's about physical condition survey audits, those things should be done. So the architects could provide an assessment of traditional patterns of use of space, how the space was used, what are the building materials used, that information. Because in the early recovery, when it comes to the construction, what we are trying to do is we are trying to support, or we are trying to help the post-disaster resettlement. So these are the background things that should be done. And the surveys, they could carry out building condition surveys, including assessment of key buildings and overall damage assessment, capture detailed information relating to land ownership, tenure and registration, those aspects. And the planners, of course, they have a big role, assess potential locations for interim settlements, transitional dwellings, and with the consultation or with the key stakeholders as well in the early recovery, they need to identify the interim settlements. Even though it's, as I mentioned, even though it's interim settlements, life is not stopping. So it should be helpful for the affected people, the places we identify for interim settlements. Engineers, of course, structural surveys of buildings and infrastructure, identify safe sites for setting up facilities and so on. And rapid mapping is needed in the early recovery stages. When it comes to rapid mapping, surveyors, they could procure and analyze satellite imagery to establish boundaries for planning properly, because maybe the boundaries are damaged. Maybe we need to identify new locations. In case of new locations, the boundaries may not be demarcated. So in that sense, surveys should play a role with the help of planning to help the planning process in doing the in demarcating the boundaries and so on. Planners work with surveyors to review mapping and establish boundaries and provide estimates, if not already available, of land use, transport and access lines, water bodies, and what are the other facilities that should be avoided, what are the restricted areas. That for that the surveying is important. And the engineers relate mapping results to sources of key vital services, how the key vital services should be established, what are the best locations and so on. And community surveys, resource mapping is also very important. So architects could work with social development agencies to carry out surveys with community groups and households for which shelter needs to be provided. But what sorts of shelter types should be designed? Maybe even though it's for a shorter period, if there are any particular needs for people for their livelihoods, maybe architects could work with the households and with the community and help them with the shelter design. Surveyors, again, they could carry out surveys of land and property ownership at the ground level, review construction skills, whatever needed. And the planners access and provide information on population, households, social. Again, this is not, planning is not about the physical structure, it's about the number of households, social and economic activities, these information. So this could be a participatory process with the help of the community's consultation. And then the engineers provide information on access, provision of key vital services. And then the land survey and acquisition comes in the early recovery. Now the early settlement is done, and in the land survey is needed carry out land surveys in consultation with planners and other specialists such as hydrologists and geotechnical scientists. Planners advise on optimum locations for transitional housing based on economic, social, and environmental consideration, and engineers provide assessments on the suitability. And then now these stages went for the early recovery stages. That's the key point. I think the learning point is, even it is for early recovery, these steps should be for a short-term transitional period. These measures should be taken in order to make the livelihoods or the lives continue with the affected people. Otherwise, they will just stop at one point and they won't be able to move on from that point till the post-disaster, the permanent settlements are done. So obviously, post-disaster reconstruction, this is long-term. Massive reconstruction works may need to be undertaken during this phase in sectors such as housing, health, education, upgrading national infrastructure. It depends on the disaster that people faced. This becomes a big job. It is not only housing reconstruction. Maybe there's a need for investments for the education, other infrastructure, and so on. So this is a summary. We work with communities to ensure that housing is allocated according to the needs of people. Strategic level physical planning and local area planning ensure overall appropriateness to local culture, in a summary. But in detail, so in reconstruction, physical planning, when it comes to physical planning, architects establish footprints of dwellings and other typical and key buildings, draw up local area layouts. It's more or less similar with the early recovery as well, but this is for permanent solutions. Surveyors and planners, strategic level physical planning and local area planning, location of buildings, key facilities, transport routes. So this is more or less now similar to urban planning, master planning exercise for urban planners. So even though it's post-disaster, there are considerations to think like when identifying the location and for build back better, but it's more like a master planning exercise for urban planners. And the engineers advise on civil works required to implement the physical plan. The urban planners do the physical plan, and the engineers, they inform the structural requirements and so on. And the land development, landscape design, architects, they design and planning of landscape elements. Surveyors, baseline survey information for planners and architects. Sorry, the title is missing. Planners, overall sitting of settlements and access routes and infrastructure, regulatory guidance and enforcements. That engineers, design and planning of drainage, further civil work. So it's now when it comes to post-disaster resettlement, as I mentioned, it's more like if you have worked in a construction project, it's more like the similar situation, but with more emphasis on how we could make the place more resilient. So housing allocations, architects work with households and communities to ensure that housing is allocated according to the needs. These things are very important in terms of the long-term satisfaction of people, because sometimes, since these are affected people, they are not they don't have option now. Their houses are damaged, so they have to accept. So in that sense, in certain scenarios, what the professionals think better is delivered to the people without thinking about the satisfaction of people. So the housing structure should be designed as per the needs of the people. This is similar with resettlement in slums and shanty development areas as well. So people's livelihood should be understood. Their needs should be understood in designing their houses. Surveyors, same job, and planners allocate dwellings in the overall plan for each settlement according to the needs assessment. So needs assessment should be matched in allocating the places. So I think this topic is relating with the long-term satisfaction of the resettlement, long-term satisfaction of the resettled communities, which is another big topic that we could talk for a day. So if you are particularly interested on resettlement side, I think there are many publications on resettlement and about the people's satisfaction, why people are not satisfied with reconstruction, what has happened after 10 years. Actually, I have my own publication as well on tsunami resettlements, about what happened after 10 years for tsunami settlements, whether they are actually satisfied. So if you are particularly interested on that aspect, you could look into some materials in that area as well. And the reconstruction advice on regulations and codes, it's important. Advice on building related regulations. Now, if you are going to build back better, if you are trying to make the areas more resilient, so advice on building related regulations should be updated. Surveyors, they implementing codes and regulations within the conditions of leases and ownerships. And the urban planners, they should propose ways to monitor and enforce regulations. So maybe we are redeveloping in a coastal area which was affected by a disaster, and now there are new regulations for that. So in that sense, the urban planner should look into that, how those could be enforced in the urban planning at the initial development. And the engineers' advice on building and infrastructure regulations, they could provide the structural quality of the buildings, and housing and building designs, architects design and building technology for dwellings, including covered, open and semi-open spaces and vegetation, avoid design faults that will require costly and frequent maintenance. Maybe they could, architects could design evacuation places from the buildings, maybe for cases like tsunami, maybe keeping the ground floor empty so the people can evacuate with the quality structural columns or structural things. So that can be done. And the surveys, of course, the costing, and the planners, they could manage overall impact on use of services and transport, etc., draw up and local planning policies and guidelines, and they could do the overall master plan. Engineers, design of typical safety features in transitional buildings, new buildings, and buildings to be retrofitted. They have a key role in doing that. Architects could identify the space use, planners can identify the space use, surveyors could do the costing and of the dwellings and all, but the engineers, they have a key role in making these dwellers, these new buildings resilient for any current disasters. So that is one of the key role of engineers in reconstruction. And then housing, building construction, advice and supervision. So supervision and advice as the buildings are constructed. Surveyors and the supervision, planners provide background information on bylaws, construction practices and compliance. Engineers, training of any volunteers and professionals to ensure safety standards are maintained. If there are any appointed key engineers, they could help the volunteers and the other trainees on how they meet the safety standards. Infrastructure planning and management, architects develop interface between infrastructure and building boundaries, of course. Surveyors design guidance. Planners publish information on land take for near sites and on-site facilities, confirm infrastructure meets demand as well, regulation requirements, develop integrated spatial strategies, that is action planning, which is very important. Like in the reconstruction, not only building the houses, maybe in reconstruction the houses are done, but their basic facilities, let's say if they need to go for groceries, it is somewhere else that are sold in a different area. So integrated facilities should be provided. Actually, what I think is what we should do is to make sure maybe the people who are affected, they had good quality lives. They are not, if I say in some words like beggars, they are not beggars. They are people who had quality lives like us. So in that sense, during the reconstruction, we should consider their convenience. It's not just providing a housing structure for people. So how the integrated facilities are given, how the other amenities, maybe the sports facilities, those master planning needs coming in urban planning, and the engineers' structural needs. And the final thing, role of a construction industry in recovery, in post-reconstruction. in the post-reconstruction, monitoring and evaluation in post-reconstruction is an important factor for a successful recovery program. It is quite important. This phase even create a successful linkage with the disaster prevention side of the cycle as well. I think this includes review and revisit dwellings and non-dwellers, observing the way people are changing their lifestyles and habitats in relation to the use of buildings, ensure safe and sustainable adaptation, periodically review the demand for infrastructure and its capacity, so on. I think I could take some example because I have been doing some research on tsunami resettlement. So what has happened is one NGO, they have funded the reconstruction process, and of course they did a good job in resettling the people. But after that, they left maybe their funding is over. They left the area, and after some time, people started to suffer. The reason is the construction materials used in reconstruction, even the roofs and the windows, as far as I can recall, is a different material to the local knowledge. It's something came from maybe the funded agency. It's something new. So what happened was, when the roof starts to leak, when the windows started to leak, the people went to the local builders, and the local builders didn't have that knowledge because it's something specific knowledge. So after some period, the NGO had already left, and they didn't have a monitoring program, and they didn't monitor how it happened, what happened after the resettlement. And after about 10 years of time, houses started to leak, and there were many issues, and there were no local knowledge to get them fixed. And when they outsourced the knowledge from different companies, it cost them a lot, which they couldn't afford to do. Like, for an example, for a roof, normal roof, it maybe it costed them double cost. So some people couldn't afford that. Even it happened with the drainage system as well. So it's a different detailed thing. So this is linking with the post reconstruction. If there is a monitoring program, maybe with the funders, maybe with the local authorities, maybe with the urban planners who are responsible, which will be good to see how people are adjusting, how people are changing their lives in the new resettlements. And if there are any immediately upcoming issues, it's good to help them in that sense in the long term. So I think that is the main areas that I wanted to cover, and we are still within the time. So I think this is not to do now. So what I'm trying to do is, I think this is for you to think after this session. So COVID, resilience and reconstruction. So of course the lives we had are changed, totally changed, and maybe in the post-COVID world it may not be the same thing. We call it the new normal. So just think about COVID, resilience and construction. So COVID-19 has affected the communities globally, and while governments and companies globally are responding fast, much remains to be done. In this difficult time, construction matters more than ever, from building hospitals in just few days to donating life-saving equipment. The industry has played a critical role in responding to the crisis and in the recovery. So the industry represents just 13% of the global GDP, and unlocking currently constrained labor availability could help drive recovery while addressing our most pressing construction-related needs. So what is the role of the construction industry in the phase of COVID? If we take COVID as a disaster, how we could be resilient for a disaster like COVID in the future, maybe for the prevention, maybe for preparedness, maybe for response, maybe for recovery. For example, I would point out now working from home, it has become the common culture now. So some work which I worked on COVID and apartments, I got to know that people in UK, because in UK this micro apartments context came. Micro apartments apartments is in London, very small sort of apartments having open plan living kitchen to accommodate young professionals and students. So what happened is, during the strict lockdown which England had in the last year, people didn't have anywhere to go, even a single balcony. So they tried to work at least in the fireplaces, sorry, not the fireplaces, fire escape stairways, or they tried to work at least in the open spaces which are created in the apartment, not within the apartment. So in a post-COVID world, and even in some situations, they didn't have a single balcony, or maybe in some apartments not proper common living areas, because people didn't want to use the common living area, so they didn't have that option as well. So in post-COVID world, maybe how we could have some measures. If we have, we cannot guarantee we will not have any other virus in this world in the next coming 10 years. Maybe there may be. So in that sense, can we really think about our built environment, how we are going to plan and design our cities, how the construction professionals can take their part? For example, maybe my assumption, and maybe with the online working environment and people are used for online shopping, maybe we don't need to plan our cities with bigger retail shops. Maybe we don't need to have office spaces allocated as we did. So these are the questions that are coming for the future. So with that, even if we have those things, so if it is the culture, working from home, online ordering, to make sure people do not psychologically in a future pandemic, to make sure they are happy, they are not stressed out in a lockdown situation, how we could, how the built environment, how we could make the built environment ready. So these are something for you to think, and not to discuss right now. So just when you have spare time, just if you are interested, just have a think about those things. And of course, so this is the end of the talk today. So if you are particularly interested about any let's say the pre-construction, or so any, I don't want to go in. So any area of the cycle, or if you have any question, you can contact me on my email is n.dias@hud.ac.uk. So I'm happy to share my views and discuss with you. So thank you very much. So if you have any questions, I think we just only got about 5 minutes, maybe, Nishara. So we can have a quick wrap-up session.
Yes. So if you have any questions or any, like, let's say, clarification, now it's the time, because we have actually 5 minutes, let's say. Yes.
If not, of course, if you want to raise your questions individually, you can email me. That's not a problem. I'm more than happy to respond to your queries. Particularly if you are working in any let's say in a particular area, like in post-disaster reconstruction or preparedness, maybe you can ask some more details on those as well.
Dr. Dias, I hope you can hear me. Thank you so much for the presentation.
Yeah.
So it was a quite a thought-provoking presentation, and what I got was that this concept of disaster resilience and construction has sort of expanded the borders of certain employments, as in surveyors, planners, who are usually limited to the technical aspects, who are now having to interact with the communities and listen to their wishes. As you correctly said, especially in the tsunami relocations, we have seen that there are serious failures because of this lack of interaction with the communities. Just wondering now, in terms of Sri Lanka, actually discussing in terms of the Sri Lankan context, we often see that these construction activities are given to private parties and their liabilities and their responsibility ends with completing the building. How can these construction employees be informed and trained with regards to the importance of continued role that they have to play after the resettlement or the relocation?
In that sense, my view is, Malit, I think it's a problem of the management. So what I think is giving, I know that giving the work to the private parties, that is of course fine. But when giving it to the private party, what we need is we need to have a government authority. For an example, let's say urban development authority, or maybe any other planning agency who got the authority to monitor what is going on with these developments, with these private organizations. So what I think is, it is necessary to have some combinations with the government organizations, and they cannot just give the job and wipe their hands. What they should do is, they should have some workshops, have some engagement with these private bodies, with the private workers, or maybe on the other hand, that should be a part of the contract with the private bodies, that they should ensure that their workers are trained in that aspect. One thing is, the government body who is responsible, after all, even after the private party has done the job, there should be some authority who is responsible. So that authority could take the responsibility to train these people. Or on the other hand, it should be a contractual agreement with these private parties to make sure that they are trained. Otherwise, this is not going to happen. I think the problem with some projects is, either them are too monetary oriented or the profit oriented, or on the other hand, maybe those are based on the charity oriented. So I think that's again coming to the way we think. So in specifically post-disaster reconstruction, there's a thought like, okay, that's fine, just to build something for these people is fine, not to make sure we are doing something better place for them. I think it's again providing training for the people, and as well as changing the mindset of these people. Otherwise, these things won't come to an implementation. Best thing is, in simple words, training these employments through the authorized authority of the government or the planning regulatory body.
Thank you, Dr. Das. Thank you so much.
Nuwan, let's take one last question. And
Sure.
I mean, Nuwan, now the issue is, now as you said, so most of the places like government offices and institutions are highly dominated by, let's say now even UDA, dominated by engineers, right? And, those who engage in, let's say, natural scientists, and they think that, they can resolve any issue or problem, right? So therefore, I think we have seen most of the time there is no collective, I would say, approach to solve a particular issue. Now, even if you take some other government organizations, when you explore their reconstruction work, sometimes, they are very much into house, construction, right? I don't have to mention that, but they have not, even if you take relocation, they say that, there are a lot of complaints from people. They did not get a very good house, and therefore we have to consider the conditions, and they put a lot of effort. But at the same time, they less attention towards livelihood development, right? So there's a lot of issues and people just go back to the previous. So something like that. So I think it's very important for us to go for a very collective approach, a holistic, I would say, perspective to resolve a particular issue, other than just trying here and there, right? But even now, the topics, some of the topics that you have touched upon now, for example, like critical infrastructure, right? Sociologists are, I mean, they are not involved, but it's highly relevant to these people. So what are your thoughts about this? Because I think I mean, it's good that this will open up another different area, and it will help us to get a more in-depth knowledge about it. But at the same time, if we get into clusters, okay, this is our part, so we'll try to develop this, and someone should not interfere and do anything, right? So I mean, that will miss the interconnectedness, interrelatedness, no? Yeah.
How about, I think it's mainly about the institutional silos, isn't it?
Yeah.
How about developing a platform that where these institutions integrate? I don't know whether there is any regulatory body or a policy framework that some professionals take the leadership and make sure these institutions come together to work. Is there any, I don't know, is there any maybe, let's say, the National Physical Planning Department, maybe can they take the leadership? Is there any if there is any regulatory body, that's, I think that way it should be done. Maybe the academics, maybe I'm not certain where to start, but my answer for that, Nishar, is definitely there should be a collaborative platform which should be developed in Sri Lanka in terms of planning. You are very correctly mentioned on the UDA. It is led by the engineers, and the big positions are given to people who really don't know about urban planning. So that's a critical issue. So I think the information sharing platform is one of the solutions which we actually could start to make a start, that we are trying to incorporate with the different disciplines. So I think that will be the starting point for that.
Thank you, Dr. Nuwan. Thank you, Nuwan, for your inspiring and excellent presentation. It's very informative, and you have presented a lot for us to think, even for me and also our participants. So with that, I would like to thank all our especially Nuwan, and then because he already accepted our invitation and did a presentation. This is the 7th one, and I think, Rasa, now we are going to finish it, because there is so I think you can just you can write the question to Nuwan, because Nuwan has already given his email address. So I would like to thank Nuwan and all our colleagues who have already participated for our this lecture, and so with that, I would like to conclude this presentation, and I hope to see you on the 8th presentation, which we are going to have it on the 25th of October. So I will inform you about the title and the time soon. Thank you, Nuwan, and thank you all. Have a good evening.
Very much. Thank you very much, Nishar, and the whole SPARC team, for the invitation. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.